Does it exist? What are the key dimensions of it? Before we start with Donald and Sudhir, just offering their views on what it is we're actually talking about.
Yeah, thanks very much, David. Thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, we struggled a lot with the title, and eventually we settled on this. I think there is a general agreement that there's a strong brand of Singapore governance, right? I've chosen to use the term Singapore consensus. I think there are 3 or 4 key ideas in there. One is this idea that Singapore is this incredibly, uniquely, inherently, immutably vulnerable place, right? Singapore all roads lead to vulnerability. And that vulnerability produces certain policy and institutional consequences, one of which is that we need this incredibly carefully selected elite to run this place, which otherwise, without this carefully selected elite system of governance, this place would just go down the toilet, right? So that's probably the first idea in the Singapore consensus, vulnerability and the need for elite governance. Then you throw in the mix things like meritocracy, which is comes as close to being a national ideology as you have. Throw into the mix things like primacy of growth, and in particular the growth model, which I would describe as one which is heavily reliant on MNCs, foreign investments, a relative high dependence on foreign labor. That's over time it's also become elevated to a level of ideologies, and it's not questioned and scrutinized and challenged as much as we think it should. And then I would also add in things like this very reflexive aversion to welfare and relative indifference to inequality as components of the Singapore consensus. And for long haul it worked. I think for the first 40 years of Singapore's independence, that model of governance, which is extremely unique to Singapore, I would argue, did deliver the goods. I mean, raised incomes across the board, all boats were lifted. But I would argue that that consensus worked for a particular era, for a particular context. And really that's what the book tries to do, which is to argue that in light of changing socio-economic and political realities, that consensus probably is beginning to fray. Citizens are much less in awe and behind that consensus. And the reality of the changing context requires quite serious rethinking around things like aversion to welfare, how we deal with inequality, whether elite governance is still the model of governance that that is best suited for increasingly democratizing Singapore.
Yeah. The only other thing I would add in terms of the elements of the Singapore consensus is democracy. So, the idea that we're vulnerable, that we've got this ethnic composition made up of different groups, our small size, all this leads to the conclusion that a regular democracy will not work here. We need a very heavy top-down authoritarian type state. So that's the only other element I would add. I want to speak a bit about sort of the etymology of the Singapore consensus. I think 3 months ago, Donald and I had a conversation, and I said, Donald, why don't we call the book the Singapore model, right? Because when I was in policy school 10 years ago, a lot of my classmates, particularly from developing African countries and Asian countries, would tell me, we want to learn more about the Singapore model, tell us about the Singapore model, so on and so forth. So the idea of the Singapore model is actually used quite frequently, but Donald's response to me, which obviously makes a lot of sense, is that when you say the Singapore model, that has very specific implications in terms of your economic model, and we weren't really wanting to get involved in that discussion. We're involved more in a higher level policy consensus type discussion. And so finally, we arrived at the Singapore consensus, and if you think about it, there is a Beijing consensus around the state's role in the economy. There is a Washington consensus out there. And so we decided that we want to push forward this idea of the Singapore consensus, which has, as Donald said, dominated in this country for a very long time. What's funny, once again, and this gets back to the point that it's not a very popular term, right before coming here, I actually Googled the Singapore consensus, just to see what the mentions are, and thankfully we are number 2 and number 3. Number 1 is a blog site set up a few months or a year ago to defend Professor Tay, who was accused last year, some of you might know, in a sex for grades scandal. So he was eventually cleared of corruption charges. But I mean, my point is, any of you googling the Singapore consensus, the very first site and mention you'll come across is a professor who likes to speak with his students.
That's nothing to do with it. Could sell more copies. And from the way that you're talking about, particularly in your opening remarks, Donald, there's a sense that the Singapore consensus over time has become increasingly rigid. I think you use the word ideology in the way that you described it. And in the book title, you're especially talking about challenging the Singapore consensus. And so I'd just be curious to get your thoughts on, why does it need challenging? You said earlier that the model had delivered good outcomes, economic, social, and other. So what are the nature of your concerns? Why do you think this model needs challenging? Has the world changed? Is it no longer working as well as it did previously? What's driving your concerns?
I mean, a lot of you know that I spent the first 15 years of my working life in the Singapore government, and it was quite intellectually stimulating, and I should say financially rewarding as well. But over time, I became quite aware of the fact that the space for genuine debate, for genuine contest of ideas within government was actually shrinking quite considerably. And it was a real problem because you were talking about competition of ideas. Most democracies rely on open competition of ideas, right? Played out across political parties, in the media, and we don't have that in Singapore. So we really rely on within government to generate that internal contestation of ideas. And in my time in government, increasingly I found that space was shrinking. And I should point out that this dearth of dissent and debate within government is a relatively recent phenomenon. So I just taught a course at the school, at the Lee Kuan Yew School, on the economic foundations of the Singapore story this semester, which just ended last week. And I came across this wonderful quote. I won't tell you who said it and when. That's for the audience to guess. And the person who guesses it right first will be the first that I'll write something on your book. I'm going to offer here, but some of you may not actually enjoy it. So who said this and when? To get two things right? I'll give you a clue. He said it in the US, right? So this is the quote. There have been no studies, to my knowledge, of the relative dependence of these countries on foreign investments as an instrument of economic growth. My own subjective impression is that this dependence is strongest in Singapore, and that the participation of national entrepreneurs in promoting industrial development is smaller here than in other countries. Not only is Singapore more dependent on foreign entrepreneurs than Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea, but the position is probably unique in that she is now dependent on the continuing supply of foreign workers to sustain growth. This then is something against which we have to consider a long-term problem of income distribution. All this involves a fundamental matter of policy. The question we must answer sooner or later is this: when do we stop growing? Or to be more precise, at what point do we stop importing foreign workers and cease to encourage foreign entrepreneurs and capital in Singapore? Because of our limited land area, industrial expansion, together with the concomitant population expansion, will produce overcrowding to increasingly uncomfortable limits. So who said this and when? Any guesses? Who? Yeah, Goh Keng Swee. When? 1972. They're the architect of our, bring MNCs to Singapore, open door policies, open door investment policy, was so willing and eager to question the very growth model that he was the primary architect of. In 1972, 7 years after Singapore's independence. It just says a lot about the nature and the quality of our policy discourse today. I don't think we have progressed. In some respects, in some important respects, I think we have regressed. But I think that the book is really a plea for to bring back that pragmatic problem solving, to bring back the cognitive diversity and the debate and dissent that used to characterize the Singapore government. And which I fear over time, because of the success of the PAP government, has slowly been sucked out of the system.
Yeah, so my viewpoint, I suppose, is very different and hopefully complements Donald's. Mine is an external viewpoint, working for 7-8 years with the Economist Group in Singapore, and during that course of time, having a lot of interactions with different aspects, facets of the Singapore government and the Singapore economy. And there are three, my one takeaway is that it seems to me that large segments of the Singapore establishment have kind of become, in terms of their ideology and thinking, have kind of become this impenetrable fortress, sort of bureaucrats and foot soldiers all walking in lockstep, kind of very trained, indoctrinated to spew doctrines that basically flow from Singapore Singapore consensus. And let me illustrate this. I mean, it can get a bit abstract, but let me illustrate this with a few examples. Now, the first is what I term sort of national confirmation bias. Now, confirmation bias is a behavioral economists will tell you it's something that all of us suffer from. It's a tendency of humans to morally accept views that sync with their own worldviews and reject views that sort of conflict with their own worldviews. Now, I think in Singapore, this becomes sort of a national level confirmation bias. We're very good at rubbishing surveys, rubbishing findings that somehow disagree with the Singapore consensus, and wholeheartedly accepting those that agree. And very simple example, working with the Economist Group, over 7 years, whenever we publish a critical article on Singapore, first, it is almost impossible to get good data and information from the government. I was writing a piece on immigration in Singapore, and I was essentially stonewalled by the immigration authorities when I wanted to get good, solid data on immigration in Singapore. And second, the articles are never ever discussed publicly, the critiques are never brought up. That's when we publish something critical. However, when we publish something that praises the Singapore government or speaks highly of something about governance here, The Economist, you may know, comes out every Friday, and on that Sunday, you can bet your last dollar that the Straits Times will have republished our article, huge full-page spread. Politicians will start discussing our article wherever they go. If you remember the G 2011, a lot of politicians were quoting a survey that The Economist had done on administration and governance in states, which actually Donald was somebody interviewed for. So, a Singaporean who does not read The Economist weekly would actually come away thinking that our publication has only good things to say about this country. Now this, and it became very clear to me that this, of course, happens for every major publication or survey around the world, but me working with the Economist Group, it was very clear to me, and this is sort of a national, what I call this national systemic confirmation bias. It's bad at an individual level for an individual's faculties and thinking, and it's bad for our country at a national level. Second example, self-censorship. For a long time, I've written about the need for Singapore to abolish national service and move towards a professional army. Now, of course, many people in this country disagree with me, but there are some people who agree with me. Two of these people are professors at 2 universities in Singapore. One is a Singaporean, one is an American. They kind of agree with my argument. Neither is willing to go on record, and both have told me in no uncertain terms that for them to publicly say that Singapore should consider abolishing national service is essentially, tantamount to killing their career. A media outlet in Singapore has also told me that it cannot allow me to express this opinion on its outlet. So, just think about this on such a basic, fundamental issue, right? National security and the need for national service. Singaporeans are not allowed to have an open, transparent, healthy debate. I mean, is this the hallmark of a developed country? Is this the hallmark of a knowledge economy which we're trying to build? It's a terribly stifling intellectual environment. So, Singapore likes to say that we allow freedom of expression and creativity in many different spheres, but in truth, it's only in very specific, limited spheres. So this, my takeaway from this is that all the actors and participants in the Singapore system, or the large majority of them, are kind of petrified to challenge first-order elements of the Singapore consensus, right? They're very willing to debate second-order and third-order elements of policy issues and smaller elements on which way housing should go or transportation should go. But once you get to a first-order issue, a pillar of the Singapore consensus, and in this case, it's our vulnerability, that Singapore is essentially vulnerable and we have to protect ourselves against hostile Muslim neighbors. Once you get to a core pillar, nobody is willing to discuss it and debate it publicly. And, I think this inevitably shapes people's thinkings and behaviors, and it's not good for the country. I think I have more to say, but conscious of time
And the third question is building on it. So you've sketched out some of the key elements of what the Singapore consensus is, and very clearly demonstrated your view on why it needs to be challenged and contested and the like. The title of the book is Hard Choices. And I've got a double-barreled question here. I mean, to me, Hard Choices sounds like a play on hard truths. So the fact that, you know,
it's not something, it is a play on
it is a play on hard truths. I'm trying to give you some wiggle room. So the notion, and partly, I guess, plays to your vulnerability narrative that you talked about earlier, that Singapore has hard truths, it's an uncomfortable world, and we may have to do things that we may not want to do. Whereas you're explicitly, I think, saying, actually, Singapore has choices. There are elements of the Singapore consensus that we can debate, we can argue about, and in your book, in the various chapters, you talk specifically about some of the specific areas of policy that you think might be up for grabs. So I'd be curious, I guess, both at a high level, get your description of the distinction between hard choices and hard truths, and then perhaps talk a bit about what some of those hard choices in your view might be.
Yeah, I mean, we chose the title again after much discussion with Peter and the other contributors to the book. As you say, really, as you know, we think that policymakers and Singaporeans in general, right, should be less guided by hard truths, right, the ideologies, the policies and practices that have served us well in the last 30, 40 years, and more guided by this idea that, you know, perhaps there are very few hard truths, very few eternal truths, that really far more meaningful debate we should be having is what are the, you know, realistic choices, what are the choices that we realistically have. So the first section of the book actually dwells a lot on the Singapore consensus, and we question many of the underlying hard truths that underpin policies, many of the underlying hard truths which make governance in Singapore exceptional, whether it's meritocracy or aversion to welfare or inequality. But the second section of the book is where we say, well, these are the areas where we need to make hard choices. One, I think, is population policy. I don't think we've really seriously grappled with the consequences of aging. And we think far too much in terms of mitigation still, right? We've got this aging tsunami, so let's try to mitigate, let's try to build this wall against this tsunami by increasing our foreign labor force from 1.5 million to 2.5 million. We still think too much in terms of mitigation. I think we should be thinking a lot more in terms of adaptation. How do we fund the retirement security of Singaporeans? How do we pay for healthcare? How do we, you know, get Singaporeans to work longer? I mean, how do we adapt as a society to a much larger elderly population? Another big hard choice that we would have to make, which we discuss in section 2 of the book, is in housing. I think over time, housing has become a national addiction, and it's probably not the best way to be thinking about retirement security, putting so much of our eggs in the housing basket. So we try to provide an argument against this national obsession on housing. Third, I think we need to rethink and reorganize and build a proper social security system, a proper welfare state. Fourth, there's an intriguingly titled chapter in section 2 called What's Wrong with Singaporeans, written by Linda. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book. I won't give the game away, but it's essentially quite a devastating critique of many things in Singapore. But that's another set of hard choices. I think I should explain why we call all these hard choices. Because in all these policy arenas, whatever we do, whatever government does, right, will probably create winners and losers. Right? Let's say we try to pull back the national obsession on housing. Well, what happens to those who have invested a lot in housing, right? Who have put in the expectation that their retirement asset will appreciate over time. So there are no easy answers, and it requires, as Sudhir would say, a transparent, open, robust debate about the kind of society, the kind of economy that we want to be.
Yeah, I mean, Dora has touched on many of the hard choices. I think I'll just mention one, partly because it's very relevant and current, which has to do around identity and, the kind of country and the kind of identity that Singaporeans want to shape for themselves. If you think about what has happened recently with the Filipino Independence Day and the furor around that being celebrated in Singapore, if you think about the Songkran Festival, people wanting to celebrate the Songkran Water Festival from Thailand and Singapore. It's, every month you have essentially a conflict between the people who see Singapore as a global city and with a global identity, and the people who are much more interested in having a more local or regional identity. And I think there are a lot of Singaporeans who feel that this global identity has been pushed down on them from above before the local sort of indigenous organic identity has had a chance to really crystallize. And because we never had a proper sort of national debate and discussion about it, I mean, there have been occasional debates. You can think back to the early 1990s when Singapore was planning for the Esplanade, and a lot of the discussions within the arts scene in Singapore had to do about to what extent do we attract international famous artists and to what extent do we support local homegrown artists. You know, so there are occasional sort of sprinklings of discussion on identity, but it's not something that we've actually had a proper conversation about. And because of this, you know, I think you see a lot of these tensions emerging in society today. So, you know, what might a more regional or local identity look like? You know, and I sometimes like to think about an alternative reality or an alternative universe where Singapore was actually, instead of trying to be this kind of jack of all trades, right, where everything to everybody around the world, you know, being instead sort of the primary city for Southeast Asia or the primary city for the Malay-Indonesian world. And that would have very, very different implications for all sorts of policies, from language policy, perhaps a greater emphasis on Malay, from, you know, international relations, perhaps, you know, greater interdependence, greater social cultural links with Malaysia and Indonesia, rather than with China and India, as an example. So I think the question and tension over identity, global versus local, you know, I think that's a very hard choice, and it's being played out with quite, you know, sometimes quite horrific consequences in society today.
Well, like we've spoken for a bit. I would be staggered if between Donald and Sudhir they hadn't said enough to provoke you and to prompt some questions in your mind. So